Good day to all. Today, I will be discussing the research on using the system dynamics approach towards a drug use problem in the Philippines, which was conducted by Joshua Lee, Kent Wong, and Dr. Jose Mutuc for the DLSU Research Congress 2022. For a brief background on the topic, illicit drug use has become a prevalent issue in many countries, with the Philippines being no exception. For example, in 2011, it was reported by the PDEA that there were 9,850 anti-illegal drug operations, which resulted in 8,491 suspects and 9,995 cases filed. With this, 250 kilos of methamphetamine, 4.8 million marijuana plants and seedlings, 17,222 grams of cocaine, and 960 ecstasy tablets were obtained in that same year alone. This is increasingly worrisome as drug use has been linked to multiple detrimental effects beyond the known psychological and physical dependencies of an individual. These consequences are outlined but not limited to economic, welfare, family, health, education, environment, and the judicial or criminal sectors, which have all shown an effect not only to the individual but also to the greater society. Given the statistics as well as the potential consequences of drug use, it poses the question whether the anti-drug policies implemented in the Philippines have been effective. Commonly, the issue has been tackled through the lens of law enforcement and criminality built on the foundation of punishment. This has been further exacerbated by the recent war on drugs spearheaded by the Duterte administration. For this study, the graph presented on the right would serve as a basis and reference for the number of drug users in the Philippines. As can be seen, the missing data points are attributed to the lack of interest in proper record keeping and the difficulty to monitor drugs due to geographic location, border controls, criminal justice system, inconsistencies in management, and others. Generally speaking, the effectiveness of the government's actions can be inconclusive, as initially the problem was controlled. However, from the years 2012 to 2016, a rapid spike had occurred. Given this information, the study would like to evaluate the drug situation in the Philippines through the system dynamics approach in order to identify factors that contribute to the problem. In doing so, it can help to guide and formulate policies and actions that can control or mitigate the growth of drug users. In light of these challenges experienced towards the drug problem, it was determined that it can be better addressed through the system modeling methodology of system dynamics. So, system dynamics is characterized by an ability to illustrate complex real world systems using resulting accumulation of resources and people through the reinforcing and balancing feedback mechanisms. In addition to this, computerized simulation models can use these concepts to test alternative policies and solutions to determine how it can affect the real world system. The model would consist of a causal loop diagram, which depicts the relationship of feedback mechanisms, and a stock flow diagram, which simulates the accumulation of variables. Once the model has been created, variables would then be tested through a sensitivity analysis, which aims to determine how a change in the input variables will affect the target variables. Findings from this stage can then be used as basis for creating proposed solutions. In addition to this, a comparison would also be conducted between the current actions of the government and the proposed solutions from this study as a way to determine if they achieve the goals, why the solution fails or succeeds, and how the solution affects the system. So here's the causal loop diagram. It presents the behavior of the problem through the feedback loops. Each positive feedback loop creates a snowball effect. For example, more drug users would result in a higher drug exposure by non-users, which would then lead to experimentation and them becoming potential users. Another example is the increase in purchases for drugs, which reduces the drug supply, causing the price of drugs to increase, also known as the law of supply and demand. An increase in the price becomes a motivation for drug dealers to increase their drug exposure, thereby reinforcing the growth of the drug population. The lone feedback loop describes a balancing behavior wherein the problem is controlled by reducing the exposure as the supply is reduced, and vice versa. This loop explains how the availability of drugs can raise or lower exposure through the negative loops. The stock flow diagram further strengthens the knowledge on the causal loop diagram. It was observed that there are two categories for the loops, this being the effect on the individual and the effect on society. So the key differences between the two would be the shorter turnaround time and emphasis on personal effects, be it psychological or physical, for the individual, and the focus on institutions as well as a larger scope of the loops for the effect on the society. An example of an effect on the individual would be the academic performance of an individual. So low grades can result in depression or low self-esteem for students, which would then influence them to take drugs as a means of comfort. In taking drugs, it can trigger and also intensify these feelings of sadness and hopelessness, which are associated with depression. Meanwhile, the effect of society could include the motivation of individuals to become drug dealers, caused by the need for money. So, this can be triggered by the financial situation of the individual, which causes them to become dealers, which in turn increases drug exposure and influences new drug users. When simulating the model, the following results were obtained. The red line represents the data obtained from the reference, whereas the blue is the simulated data from the model. These two lines should mimic one another as closely as possible to ensure the accuracy of the model. Observations showed that the positive feedback loops reinforce the current trends, mainly in terms of the exposure, while the negative loops slow down the action through the availability of supply. However, at a certain point, the supply would reduce and slow down the exposure of new drug users. When extending the simulation towards the year 2040, it can be seen that there's an upwards trend despite the initial control. In-depth analysis determined that a large accumulation of drug users in jail placed considerable impact towards the likelihood of a adoption for the future generation. Conducting the sensitivity analysis showed that changing individual variables provided little effect on the problem. Multiple variable analysis must be conducted to yield significant results. Among the variables that proved most effective were in regards to the drug supply, such as importation laws, exposure, and the availability of customers. Simulating current efforts of the administration, mainly towards the drug supply and awareness, appeared to show slight improvements as shown in the graphs. However, the general trend still remains undesirable. Rather than improving the behavior, the solutions were just able to delay the growth. The reason behind the failure of the government can be attributed to the over-reliance on reducing the current number of drug users rather than observing the system holistically. Though they are able to momentarily reduce the number of drug users through imprisonment, it resulted in an unintended consequence as it was observed to be worse over time. Imprisonment is not effective in preventing the relapse of the drug dependent users, as it does not serve as an appropriate bridge between their time in jail and integration into the real world upon release. Generally, prison or jail time can just be considered as a timeout for the individuals rather than providing them tools to stay away from drugs. Effects of imprisonment can also have adverse effects even after the inmate has served time, since it can cause an individual to have a difficult time seeking their basic needs, such as obtaining a house or finding a job, as a result of the criminal record that they would have. Even when these dependent users are out of jail, the effects of their imprisonment would burden them, creating a cycle of addiction. The close family members of the dependent users are also at risk, as they would be exposed to a greater likelihood in adopting drugs since they are not able to receive the family guidance, a lower likelihood of education, and higher risk of poverty, which are all able to contribute to developing a drug addiction. Given these findings, three different solutions were posed, being education, integration of the dependent users, and rehabilitation of the dependent users. From the simulation, it appeared that the rehabilitation proved to be most effective. Rehabilitation as a proposed solution aims to address the finding of the great accumulation of users in jail, as well as the impact of imprisonment towards affecting the individual and their close relationships or surroundings. It entails that the drug dependent users would be given proper treatment and tools to combat their addiction rather than serve time in jail through imprisonment. Though the problem was initially worse as compared to the original model, by the year 2027, the system appeared to be in an equilibrium wherein the number of users have been controlled. This solution proved to be effective as it reduces the chance of relapsing, increases the integration and influence from family, and provides education on the prevention techniques, which contributes towards helping the future. It is also somewhat contradictory to the current actions of punitive measures as it emphasizes on providing treatment rather than the preferred imprisonment set by the government. Thus, it is advised to explore this approach as a method of controlling the growth of drug users in the future. From this, we were able to utilize a system dynamics approach to have a better understanding on the drug problem through the feedback loops and the simulation of accumulation. The supposed positive actions can also result in unintended consequences, such as how supply or imprisonment can encourage new dealers or increase the susceptible future generations. It is then advised that the rehabilitation of drug users be prioritized as it focuses on the unintended consequence. In some ways, the drug problem is structurally similar to the COVID pandemic, as exposure is a key variable that reinforces contamination and the spread of the disease. An increase in the patients would reduce in a decrease in the facilities and resources necessary to combat the virus, which would then increase the number of cases. Note that the effective supply is positive in the COVID problem, while it is negative in the drug problem. Lastly, as a result of the complexity of the system, future studies can continue to explore new variables and loops that may have a greater impact on controlling the drug trade in the Philippines. Thank you. Here are just a few of our references, and thank you.